is Filip Rakowski. I'm a CTO and co-founder of Vue Storefront, and today I want to share with you what we have learned about Composition API during last year when we were working with it every day. So how it changed our approach to the Vue code, what became simpler, what challenges we faced. You'll hear about all of the stuff today. So in Vue Storefront, we were one of, or maybe even the first ones, to ship Composition API into production with large-scale projects. And we based all our APIs of Vue Storefront Next, which is a new version of Vue Storefront, on Composition API. Okay, but there is a high chance you have no idea what Vue Storefront is. And since this is a virtual conference, I can't really check how many of you know. So I think it's worth explaining this. So this super simple diagram basically shows the essence of Vue Storefront. It's a framework for building e-commerce frontends that connects with any e-commerce platform, CMS, ERP, loyalty platform, and any other platform that is usually present in e-commerce shop. And we are using Nuxt for our default theme, but nothing is stopping you from using it in any other Vue environment, since this is a framework. And we are backend agnostic, which means that the same code works for any e-commerce platform, CMS, etc. combination. And we are heavily focused on delivering great developer experience, just like Vuex. And we are open source from the day zero, and you can find us on GitHub. I think we are currently the biggest e-commerce frontend project in the world, which is super cool. And our public API layer is basically just a bunch of self-contained independent Composition API functions that are responsible for interactions with different domains within e-commerce space. So like cards, product catalog, CMS, etc. And that's basically it. We try to keep things simple. Also, there is a big news I want to share with you. So last 3 years, we were a part of a company called Devante. This is where we are originating from. But we have grown so much from this tiny open source project to the biggest product of its type in the world that from this December, Vue Storefront is no longer part of Devante and we are becoming a totally independent company. Actually, we're operating like this for a few months already, and we have a great team working full-time on Vue Storefront. And I want to thank everyone in Vue community who supported us in the last 3 years. It couldn't happen without you. Thank you so much. And we will be hosting a webinar about the future of Vue Storefront as an independent company, where we also want to announce a few things. So if this is something that interests you, you can find it under this link, vuestorefront.io/events. And okay, now let's talk about the Composition API. So there is a chance that you survived the last year without even knowing what Composition API is. So just to make sure we are all on the same page, I'll briefly explain what it is. The simplest possible definition would be calling it a set of Vue APIs that can be used outside or even without Vue components. And a good example of similar API in Vue 2 is Vue Observable, which was basically exposing the Vue reactivity system outside the components. And this is how Composition API looks like. So we are importing component features we want to use as functions. Then we are using these component features as functions in setup method, which is a new component API. And everything that is returned by the setup method then is available on the template. So the same way as data, methods, computed properties were available, everything returned from setup method is also available. We can divide Composition API functions into two groups. So the old ones that are kind of like syntactic sugar for currently existing APIs, and new ones that are bringing some additional functionalities. The old API wrappers are basically wrappers over currently existing APIs, so we can find a lot of well-known names like reactive, ref, and lifecycle hooks or watchers. The new ones include mostly helper functions meant to help us working with the old ones and bringing some extended functionalities. Now that we are all on the same page, it's time to talk why Composition API is so great and how it changes the way we are building our applications. One of the biggest benefits in terms of code maintainability is the fact that composition APIs allows us to organize our code in much more flexible way. If you ever tried to think out of the box and invent your own way of organizing Vue code, you've probably quickly noticed that there is one particular way that is heavily promoted in the Vue ecosystem: grouping your files and functions by their type. In fact, the way how framework works is promoting this approach as well. Let's see some more examples. So the place where this approach is visible the most is obviously on the component level. When we build a Vue component that contains different functionalities, we have no way of keeping the logic responsible for a certain feature or domain in one place. We are putting all methods in methods property, data in data property, then invokes some methods in lifecycle hooks. So if we assign a color to each feature, our component looks more or less like the one on the right side. So it's distributed across whole component, like every feature is distributed across whole component. And it's not that much different on the project level. The framework itself is giving here much more freedom, but we have to organize our code the same way to be consistent. So in most cases, we're ending up with the folder structure like this. Okay, but is it even bad? I think there's nothing wrong in organizing your code this way. We have a good reason to do this, but my subjective opinion is that for most of the projects, it could lead to some maintenance issues, even significant one. And the more complex your application becomes and the bigger it becomes, the bigger these issues could become as well. So we usually work on a certain feature, not a file type. Imagine, like, when was the last time you saw a task that asked you to work only on created hooks of your application? It's much better to have everything related to a certain feature in one place, rather than look for every piece of a puzzle across your whole code base. Otherwise, it's hard to be confident about understanding the full context of a certain feature. So what if there is some additional dependency that you have missed and will make all your efforts wasted? Or if you leave some code in your code base related to a feature that was actually removed a long time ago, it's confusing. So if that approach can lead to so many issues, why we're not just organizing our code based on the features this code is related to? Is there any good pattern for that? Well, there is a great paradigm that probably many of you already know that may help to some extent. It's called domain-driven design, and its foundations are around structuring and naming your code accordingly to the domains you're operating within. For the e-commerce space, these domains are oriented around product catalog, customers, placing orders. So based on them, we can model all the functionalities of our application. So let's say we've just finished the scoping session and we want to structure our code according to our business domain. There is a great article about this approach that I highly recommend you to read. The author shows how to organize your code into so-called domain modules, where all features related to a specific domain are in a single module. And the LDR of this article is basically the following screenshot. So the upper example shows the classical folder structure, where we organize our files by type. And at the bottom, we see the domain-driven approach. So each directory is basically a single domain module. Okay, but how we can apply this in Vue.js? Because I've just said that the framework itself is promoting a different approach. So does it mean we can't do anything? Well, actually we can. And we have done something like this in Vue Storefront even before the Composition API. So now that you know what domain modules are, I think it will be straightforward for you to understand another concept. Vue Storefront modules. Every Vue Storefront module contained mixins, Vue stores, routes, types, etc. required for a given feature to work. And what was great about modules is the fact that there was only one place where you were registering all of them, and if you wanted to remove a module or replace it, we had all the puzzles in one place, so there was no risk of overlooking some side effects. The module function looked like this. So it had access to app instance, store, router, app config, and you were able to hook into all places of your application just from the single function. And you could imagine that we could pass even more context in here, so it's really handy. And this is what was actually imported as this domain module, as this Vue Storefront module. Now, when we wanted to register this module, we just needed to pass it to register module function with some optional config, just like we do with Vue plugins. And when we utilized this approach, it was much easier to maintain our code and reason about the features that are in our application, because each feature was just a folder, so it was straightforward. But the solution wasn't perfect. First of all, we still can't utilize the component features from the functions within our domain modules. We can only ship whole components or mix some properties in, but mixins are basically really bad architectural choice for almost any application. And since our approach is our own approach, it feels unnatural at first and adds to overall complexity of the application. Okay, so it's already middle of the talk and I barely scratched the surface of my topic, so let's fix that. And now that we have a good overview of the DDD approach in Vue 2, let's see if Composition API brings any improvements in this area. Let's start with the component level. In Composition API, we have all the code in a single setup function. No special property for methods, computed properties, etc. Just setup. And because of that, we can group code related to a certain feature together. So it's much easier to navigate through it. But we can do even more. We can externalize it. Because Composition API does not require components to work, we can put business logic related to a specific feature in a separate function and make it reusable across whole application. So each composable is taking care of a specific feature. And you could say that it was also possible with mixins, but they had numerous issues. First of all, we could run into name collisions with component API. Also, there was lack of transparency, like what we are mixing in. So you can think about Composition API as mixins that are done right. Our root components or page components can now utilize these composables. So this is an example from Vue Storefront, from login component, and you have to admit it's super readable. And it's even better on the project level. We have everything related to a certain feature in a single folder, and we also have a single entry point for all of that we can use anywhere in our app, and this entry point is decomposable, of course. So if all the code related to a certain feature is in one place, so we have full understanding of it without worrying that we forgot about some of its pieces, it's much easier to extend such feature. It's much easier to remove it if there are no external dependencies, and generally it's basically much easier to maintain such code. So it's easier to maintain code that is written with Composition API. And this is a single one reason to use it. Okay, enough about theory. Now let me show how we use that in Vue Storefront. All the business logic that you have in Vue Storefront is basically a set of Composition API functions. If you want to use Vue Storefront, you just install the package with the integration you want to use, and from there you can use it. So the integration contains Composition API functions and the configuration method for API keys, etc. So nothing else. And of course, we are also shipping a default theme. And this is how a typical Vue Storefront composable look like. So what makes Vue composables much better than React hooks is the fact that they are embracing Vue reactivity. And because of that, they can manage their own state. And this is much bigger advantage than it seems. In fact, with Composition API, you probably won't need Vuex or any other state management library. Under the hood, the enormously simplified version of such composable could look like this. So all implementation details are hidden, and we're exposing the composable state and functions that are basically interacting with the state. So kind of like Vuex, yeah? And implementation details are hidden, and because of that, we can modify its internals without introducing API changes. So this is super cool. And in this example, we have used computer properties to make sure that our state is read-only, so we can be sure that it can be modified only from these functions that we're exposing, like search in this example. And because we don't manage the state in the UI, the components are much cleaner. Take a look at this example. This is a simple product page built with Vue Storefront. And in product page, what we usually want to display is product information and maybe a button allowing us to add this product to the cart. So of course, we will use product and use cart composables, pretty intuitive. And we will invoke search method to fetch the product and load to load the cart. We are invoking these methods inside use fetch hook because this example is from Nuxt. And it works exactly like a fetch method, but it's usable inside setup. And we're getting a first variant of a product and assigning it to the product object. Now look at the UI. In just 2 lines of code, we handled loading state and loading failure. And below we are displaying product information using getters. So getters are just functions that are meant to help extracting some data from complex objects like products or categories. And at the end, we are adding add to cart button. So this is a fully working product page that you can write in 5 minutes. And all of that because most of the logic lies in composables. So we managed to separate the UI part from business logic part. Pretty much like it was with Vuex, except we don't even need it now. And sometimes you need to share the same state between composables. For example, we want to have access to the same cart object with use cart composable, even if it's instantiated in many components at the same time. So when I add a product on a product page, I want it to be visible in a mini cart component immediately. In that case, the only thing that we have to do is basically lifting up your state outside of the composable. And it will be instantiated only once, not every time the composable is invoked. And because of that, it will be shared across all composable invocations. That's it, as simple as that. But a raw composition API plugin for Vue 2 won't work very well with server-side rendering and Nuxt. So we have a number of Nuxt specific features like async data or fetch that are allowing developers to convey the data from server to the client. And otherwise we would need to fetch them multiple times. So we would have to fetch the data on the server side, generate the HTML, and then fetch it on the client side and populate our JavaScript objects with this data. With Nuxt Composition API module, you can put logic responsible for handling server-side rendering inside your composables. So they have composition functions that you can use to handle server-side state and fetching, and they are mostly wrappers to currently existing features. For example, use async is a wrapper for async data, use fetch is a wrapper for fetch, etc. And if you want to learn more about Nuxt Composition API, you can read how to do this from my article on Vue School, which I obviously recommend. But keep in mind that Nuxt Composition API has some bugs and is definitely not production ready. We had to do some workarounds in Vue Storefront to make it work. I will tell a little bit about them shortly. But to have it fully production ready, I think you have to wait for Nuxt 3. Okay, so like if you want to have a shared state between composables, even Nuxt Composition API can't really help you. Why? Take a look at this example. If you invoke this code on Nuxt server-side rendering, you will basically break your hydration, since you don't have any information about the component context that is required by the Composition API plugin to work on server-side rendering. So it's just invoked too early to have this context. And to avoid this situation, we have to put the lifted up state inside the composable. So it's invoked within a component context, but then how to make its value shared between components if it's instantiated every time we are invoking this composable. So our thought was that the easiest way for that is basically to identify these values that we want to share by some unique identifiers. So we can refer, for example, to the ID in other places of our application. And it's a that simple concept of key value per database. And once we know the key that is associated with some data in the database, we can easily access it and override it. Imagine how surprised we were actually when during the research on how to implement that, we discovered that Nuxt Composition API module is basically doing exactly this under the hood through a Babel plugin. So the production code generated by this plugin has keys associated with all SSRFs and some other properties. You can easily find that part in Nuxt Composition API module repository. We can see a list of properties like useasync or SSRF that have their unique keys injected by the Babel plugin. But because it happens automatically, we can't really benefit from that in our case without hacking the Babel plugin. But trust me, like if there is one thing I have learned the hard way, it's that you shouldn't modify the internals of tools that you're using. Never, period. Unless you're very adventurous and basically don't have to ship something important to the production. So if we can't modify this, we had to do this by ourselves. And the solution was super simple. We just created a wrapper over SSRF called sharedref. The sharedref is basically a key value store for values of SSRFs. So you can either declare it with a default value or just create a new key in the store. Now, when we access the sharedref, we first check if there's one with a given key already existing, and if there is, we just return its value, and if it's not, we are just creating a new one. VSFref is our wrapper for refs, so depending on which environment you work with, like VCLI, Nuxt, Gridsom, you can associate framework-specific ref to it. In case of Nuxt, VSFref is equal to SSRF. So the example with a shared state that we have lifted up will look like this. And now it will work perfectly with Nuxt SSR. This approach brings some additional benefits as well. So since our users are in charge of the keys, they can control how the state is shared. Take a look at this example. Use product composable that is used to fetch products. By default, it should work independently and always create a new state. So every time we use product, we usually want to fetch different products. This is why you have to provide a unique key every time you instantiate it. So this is this ID. But if you run into a use case when you wanted to share the state between different composables and between different components, the only thing that we have to do is basically providing them with the same ID. So now both invocations of useProduct are referring to the same place in our sharedref key value store. And you must admit that this is super useful and powerful. So with all the state management possibilities, you basically don't need Vuex at all. Of course, I'm not saying that you don't need for any application, but the number of use cases for Vuex right now is much smaller because we can handle our state perfectly with just Composition API. But you don't need this, but if you really like the Flux architecture and the Flux approach that Vuex is based on, you can easily build your own Vuex with Composition API. So take a look at this example, also from Vue Storefront. We have a state, we have mutations that are modifying the state, we have getters. So basically we have a Vuex built with Composition API. And this is super, super, super cool. And that would be it. So thank you very much. And I hope you learned something interesting from this talk and that it inspired you to use and experiment with Composition API. And I can only say that for Vue Storefront, it was an absolute game changer. It simplified not only our public API, but also a lot of our internal APIs, allowed us to manage our code in a much easier way, to organize it better. It's definitely worth it. And you can check how we used it in our repository. And don't forget to leave a star if you like the project. And thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, Filip.
Hello.
Thanks for the thanks for the great talk. You mentioned I have several questions from myself, and I believe our audience probably could have the same questions as well. And with the Composition API, you mentioned that we don't actually need a Vuex anymore. But you still mentioned that there is a number of applications that could still use it. From your experience, could you share with us your vision, like where the Vuex is still needed? Because Composition API is so powerful. So yeah, it would be great to hear your opinion over here.
Yeah, thanks. So I think like for most of the simple applications with not very complicated state management, you don't need Vuex anymore. E-commerce, even though like the overall complexity of the application has very simple state management, because basically you have the cart, you have categories, you have products, maybe you have some user state, and basically that's it. So for such applications, I definitely don't see a reason to use Vuex right now. Of course, like the main benefit is basically debugging right now, but you also have tools like Pinia from Pozva, who made the Vue router, and you can use Pinia to basically have Composition API and tracking in the DevTools. So like, I'm also not a big fan of using Vuex. So maybe this is totally subjective, but I think only for projects that have very complicated state management that could make sense, and for simple ones, I think it only brings some overcomplication. Something that is already simple.
Thank you. I see. And my second question is for the Vue Storefront. It's a quite big platform actually, and seems like you changed a lot of internals during the transition to the Vue 3 and in future Nuxt 3. What is your favorite feature that became more sophisticated with the Composition API within this transition?
Whoa, that's a hard question, actually. Maybe not. Maybe I will approach this question a little bit differently, because the biggest benefit that we see with Composition API is this modularization that wasn't that easy before, and we had to do a lot of hacks actually to make it work. And with Composition API, everything is a little bit simpler. In some cases, it's even much simpler, and I think that's the biggest benefit. So maybe not making something more sophisticated, but making it simpler.
Okay.
Yeah, we are. Whoa! I think I broke something. Okay. I mean, we are not using Vue 3 yet because it's not possible with Nuxt to right now. So we're waiting for Nuxt 3, but we're trying to prepare for Vue 3. We are not using portals yet. We are not using any kind of this stuff. But as far as I know, the new version of Vue 2 is going to bring some, some features from Vue 3. All that can be ported into the latest version of Vue 2. So maybe we will be able to also use this in Nuxt 2. But right now it's only Composition API. Of course, you have to think about Vue 3 because there are some breaking changes. If you're not aware of this, then even if you will use the plugin, you will end up with a rewrite of your code base. Yeah, that's a long answer, and I already answered the question at the beginning.
Thanks. How long for your team took to change the mindset to write on the Composition API Because it seems like we're going to face it as a Vue community a lot.
Yeah, like being completely honest, like the first glance is that you're just taking this and you're working with this, and this is super cool. But if you're combining this with Nuxt, the complexity is much higher, because then you have to think about server-side rendering, and Nuxt basically is not designed to handle this kind of stuff outside of the components. So when you're making a library that has to link along with Nuxt and is built on Composition API and has to work with server-side rendering, you had to do a lot of workarounds. So I would say, like, we are actually still learning about this. We are still discovering some issues. And we started, I think, on February or something like this. But that it doesn't mean that it's hard. It just means that it's not yet well documented, and most of the things we discovered we had to learn by ourselves and learn the hard way. But I think it shouldn't take more than 1-2 months for any team to feel very confident with this, together with all this caveats of server-side rendering once it's properly documented. The biggest issue we faced actually was that when we were invoking our composables and they had access to some other state that wasn't directly in Nuxt, the state was leaking into a general context of Nuxt, so it wasn't specific to a specific request. And this is a serious security issue. And when you're using Composition API, it's super easy to actually get into this mistake, because you're not writing your code in components. So this is something that took us pretty long time to figure out, and actually to even discover, which was a little bit bad. But apart from this, it's super easy API. Basically, you have mappings to everything that you already know. So once you learn these basic mappings and learn how to not screw up with the Nuxt context, you're good to go.
Yeah, we're heading in that direction. You mentioned also never modify the tools internals you're using, period. Seems like there is some story behind. Could you share it with us if possible?
Yeah, there's much more than one story. I mean, in Vue Storefront 1, we hacked the libraries that we're using pretty extensively. And because of that, initially it was a good fix, but also if you're modifying the internals, it's basically you're modifying not the public API. So something that can be changed even with a minor upgrade, like with a patch that you're installing through NPM. And that happened to us many times, also to our clients. So you're about to roll into the production, and then in your package JSON, your packages are applying the patches automatically. And the day before the client has to roll into production, they see everything is ruined, nothing is working. And under such conditions, it's not straightforward to figure out that this happens because we have overwritten something from the internals of the library. And when you're doing something, you sooner or later end up in the situation that the version was updated suddenly, something has changed, and you have no idea what is happening. And we had not only one story like this with Vue Storefront 1, and in Vue Storefront Next, we are trying to avoid this at all costs. Of course, it's not so easy actually, because sometimes you have to, especially with Nuxt Composition API, once there was some it's not production ready, as I mentioned, like computed properties, for example, are not working properly. And we made a pull request to the repo that was fixing this, but it was fixing this in a way that it's not compatible with how Vue 3 will work. So they didn't accept that. And like the obvious solution was, okay, so let's fork it, or let's just create a small path for this. Of course, that was the obvious solution, but because we have this PTSD from Vue Storefront 1, we decided to do kind of like a workaround for this. And it took much more work, but also I feel much more confident because I'm still using the public APIs. I mean, I think that's a situation that everyone had in their career, at least every advanced developer, because the more we understand the code that we are using, the more tempting it is to hack this, and hacking is not always the best solution. I would say, like, mostly it's not the best solution.
Have you had a story when you forked some solution, and then like within the time you decided to go back into the mainstream solution? like you need to rewrite code again, or like it's like one-way ticket?
Usually we haven't forked that, but just we're freezing the version. After some time, we're freezing the version and just overriding some stuff from the inside. But the issue is if you like, okay, one option is you're freezing the version and you're not getting these updates, but most likely you're getting some security issues or that sort of stuff, or you're basically froze to the bugs, or you're allowing these paths automatic updates, but you're living in fear because you never know if something will break. But we're not forking usually. We're trying not to fork tools because they're constantly updated, they're constantly evolving. We were very tempted to fork Nuxt Composition API and to do our own version, but then we would also have another repository to maintain, and we don't feel that much confident to do this.
How many repositories you maintain in the same way at this point, if it's public information?
You mean by the same way? What do you mean?
By freezing the version and adding your patches in a Vue Storefront.
I think only the core right now of Vue Storefront 1 has some dependencies like this. But as I said, we're trying to avoid this right now. It's not the best practice. I would consider this as a last resort when you just want to use this library. Something is not working properly. Maybe not even it doesn't work as you want, but it's not working properly. We have kind of like a PTSD. It's a good word, really, because when you have to roll into production and you see a lot of issues you have no idea about, that it's causing so many stress, you don't want to do this anymore.
Absolutely, PTSD is a horrible thing in developers world. And in not developers world as well. You mentioned a lot about the SSR. Could you give us maybe a couple hints or like best practices for the SSR, since it's widely used approach?
Yeah, sure. So like maybe not only the SSR itself, because for SSR itself, I think the most common issue you could get run into is a mismatch of HTML from the server and the HTML that is generated during the hydration process. And because of that, you're basically losing all the performance gains from the server-side rendering because your page is not hydrating the already existing HTML. It's recreating this from scratch. So that would be the first thing. Whenever you see a console that there is a hydration error, I think it's called mismatch as an error, then you probably just have to debug this and quickly see what caused that. It's usually either some only client-side code or a directive in most cases. The second thing, and we really learned this hard way with Nuxt and Composition API. I told about this in the previous question. Take care of the context. Always test if the context is not shared, if the tokens are not shared, if you're accidentally not logged into as a user who has logged in other computer. So I think that's the biggest challenge with Nuxt Composition API, because it's super easy to overlook that. You basically, when you are working with Nuxt Composition API and you have maybe different layers in your application, so maybe you have this data layer, then you have composables, then you have the UI layer like we do, and in Nuxt.js, basically you always have to invoke, not only in Nuxt, but in Nuxt specifically, you always have to invoke the composable only in the setup method, nowhere else, because otherwise it could break. And even if you invoke this in the setup method, maybe inside this composable you have some code that is accessing some global variables, and those global variables are most likely shared. So what we are doing is we're basically passing down the context from the component to the composable, from the composable to the API client, from the API client to the API client methods. I think that's the only way to do this. It's not very elegant because it's not performance friendly, because basically you can't do a tree shaking because everything has to be in one object that has access to this context. But we haven't found a better solution. What else? I think if you are working with Vue Composition API right now, and you are working with this in Nuxt, you will most likely end up with an error that either you have to use Vuex to use Vue Composition API, or it is already registered. And in most cases, the issue of that is that you have used Composition API outside of your component. So these are the 3 tips I would give people that we are running into constantly, even though we know, I mean, how they are occurring. It's super hard to avoid them.
Yep. Thank you, Filip. There is another question from the community, actually, and the question sounds like, do you have a written style guide on structuring and naming files, functions, variables that other could follow within your storefront?
We haven't got it written down. We have some rules about the API itself. So if you go into our documentation, in this docs/next .vuestorefront.io. So if you go into our documentation, on the left side you have a contributing section, and in this contributing section you have something called API design philosophy. So this is just a set of rules that we're trying to follow while designing Vue Storefront. But I don't think it would be very useful for people that are not directly using Vue Storefront but just want to get something out of the Composition API, because everyone are using this differently. Maybe you can just take a look at our APIs and see the patterns that we are using, especially regarding state management, and try to utilize them. But we don't have this style guide written anywhere. Like the low level with the naming and stuff like this.
Yeah, I see. Another question here is, we have an idea to separate components folders with views, pages, and components. The idea is to split smart components and dump components. What would you say on this? Because this is pretty old idea, and is it still relevant? Keeping the smart and the dump components.
Yeah. This is super interesting question, because we also thought about this heavily, because this is kind of intuitive that in the old way you always had the smart pages and dump components. And with Composition API, we are basically still trying to follow this approach. And just because it's much easier to maintain such code, because you're basically still, you basically still have one smart component per page usually, and it's much easier to to remove some data to actually know what is happening in there. So I don't think there's a difference between the old way and the new way, even though there's a post from Dan Abramov, who is basically the father of React. He hasn't created this, but he's perceived as one, where he was writing that with hooks, which are actually equivalent of Vue composables, they were first even. So with hooks, this approach with dumped smart components doesn't make that much sense. So I think it's totally subjective. For us, it still makes sense, and I would recommend this. But I also see the point where people are saying, okay, it's old way, and we don't need this, because composables and these hooks, they're allowing you to interact with the data in completely different ways. But you can also think about hooks, composables, as basically Vuex, because initially, like in Vue Storefront, the API is pretty similar. The search method is always an action, then you have getters for specific properties. So when you are using Vuex, you are still using this Vuex in smart components and passing the data down to the dump ones. So with composables, basically, we try to follow the same approach. I'm not saying it's the right approach. I'm saying it works for us.
Thank you. Thank you for questions. It was a Filip, and yeah.
Thank you very much for having me the second time. Bye-bye.
Bye.